Apothecary Podcast. Authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Pod guests share their desert island drugs and joyful patient stories.
Welcome, this is the Oral Apothecary Podcast. My name is Jamie Hayes. Welcome to episode 9 of our second series. This week we're joined by Professor David Slawson. David is the Chair of Family Medicine for Atrium Health and a Professor of Family Medicine with the University of North Carolina. He's an international lecturer in evidence-informed decision-making and information mastery. And he's our first guest from across the Atlantic. We'll hear from David in a moment as he shares his desert island drug, a career anthem, and recommends a book for the Oral Apothecary Library. For some medical tests and procedures, there's a point at which, despite our best intentions, we harm more people than we help. That's a quote from this week's micro discussion, where we'll look at the issue of unintended harm of our good intentions, the issues of overuse and overdiagnosis. First, let me welcome my two fellow apothecaries. STC is in Bournemouth and Gimmo is in Cardiff. Welcome both. What have you been up to?
Evening all. So, watching football like everyone else. Commiserations to Wales. That was not pleasant to watch. They had a great game against Turkey, but then they went out to Denmark, who I think everyone's favourite at the moment. But England are through, so I think as you're listening to this, they will have played their quarter-final game. So I don't know if it's coming home, but hopefully it is by then. A big shout out to Mark Tobert, who's our guest early on the season. He's our German guest a few weeks ago. I know he took it in good spirit, but obviously he'll be disappointed. The other thing I've done this week is I went to the launch of something called Green Health Wales. So this is a movement that's started to encourage more sustainable healthcare. And obviously, as we come out of COVID, this is sort of on everyone's lips at the moment, is starting to think about sustainable healthcare. But it did get me thinking and talking to people about what can be done to support sustainable healthcare, particularly in community pharmacy. So probably one that we'll pick up in a future episode. But any thoughts, get in touch with us on Twitter.
I watched the football a bit, but I've continued in my quest to listen to podcasts and also to pimp myself, or perhaps the Oral Apothecary, a bit harder on social media. So this week I tried to get Dr. Pete Turton, who's the actual junior doctor who does the funny bit on the placemat. He hasn't agreed yet, but I'm chasing him.
Nobody likes needy or desperate.
I know, you always say that to me, but hey, we're shameless on the Oral Apothecary. I've also managed to capture, I think is the right word, Dr. James McCormack, who is a professor of pharmacy in British Columbia, and that's because he runs a great podcast called the Best Science Medicine Podcast, which we'll put the link actually in the show notes because it's not easy to find, and they call it BS without the BS, as in best science without the bullshit. And him and a GP called Mike Allen have done it. Oh, they've been doing it for years, actually. They're on episode 483. And truth be known, we did have a little listen to their products before we started doing this. But the reason why I'm telling you is that they have just done a fantastic podcast about aducanumab, which is the new Alzheimer's drug, which you, I'm sure, have read about in the States and the FDA. And of course, it's the whole thing about we want poos, not do's. And it really unpacks quite nicely and kind of throws its arms up at why did the FDA even go any further with this when they had to go into sub-analysis and, it's not good. But anyway, the podcast is excellent and Dr. James McCormack has agreed to come on in series 3.
Can I just say quickly, we did listen to another podcast this week, didn't we, Steve? It was Jamie's first effort at podcast in 2012, was it?
11.
Let's just say he's come on a long way.
Just an innovator. way ahead of the curve.
He needed a couple of side dummies.
Yeah, stooges, that's right. Anyway, a few things from me. Look, our Middle East figures are looking good. And we've been number 1 in the Apple medical charts this week in Kenya. So thanks to our Kenyan audience and our listeners over there. Thank you. Please get in touch. I had a couple of beers last night with a former fighter pilot. Now he's a commercial pilot. He's been furloughed since September. And I know that several pilots that have been furloughed in the UK have found themselves into the healthcare environment with their human factors experience, and they've wandered into the medicine safety agenda as well. But he was saying that he hasn't flown since September, and we were just talking about, well, what does that look like in terms of expertise, but when he needs to get back in the plane. So he's got to do some big sessions in the simulator before he gets cleared to fly again. So it's quite an interesting conversation around all the human factor stuff that we've covered over the last 2 series.
James, can I just ask, is it every 6 months or every 12 months that a pilot has to prove that they can take off and land a plane?
We didn't get onto that, if I'm honest.
You know, we were talking the week before about, I think it's wrong that prescribers don't have to prove competence on a regular basis. And it's the pilots that I usually always use as an example. You know, you wouldn't want to get in a plane if they couldn't prove that they could take off and land. And it's the same with prescribing, but hey ho.
Well, he did use the example of, well, it's a bit like asking you to get, to go back to a pharmacy after years away. And I slouched into my chair at that point anyway. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor David Slawson to the Oral Apothecary podcast. As I mentioned, David currently serves as the Chair of Family Medicine for Atrium Health. He's a Professor of Family Medicine at the University of North Carolina. He holds an adjunct professorship at Hong Kong University and is an international lecturer, as I said, in evidence-informed decision-making and information mastery, which we will get onto in a moment. He is the proud father of 4 children, including triplets. And here's the bit, look, he has a passion for hiking and fly fishing for native brook trout in the Blue Ridge and Smoky Mountains. What's not to like? Welcome, David, to the Oral Apothecary podcast. What's on your agenda at the moment, David?
Thank you, Jamie, Paul, and Steve. This is like a historical reunion for me. We all met each other back in the past in various information mastery workshops. My colleague Alan Shaughnessy was supposed to be with me, and I'm sorry he's not here. He will love to come and meet with you later on. But, I'm just here really to talk about kind of where information mastery kind of historically has been and where we are now with it and where we're hoping that it's going to go.
So, Dave, not all our audience will have heard the words information mastery, and we'll come back to our journey with it in a moment. But where did it start for you and Alan then?
Jamie, we both spent time at McMaster University with David Sackett, Brian Haynes, and we both went through the workshops there and learned about critically appraising literature, and we did that separately, independently of each other. But when we got together, we both sort of realized we needed to come up with thought it was great stuff, but we needed to come up with a way that it was more practical in the real world. So we kind of coined the phrase information mastery, and it was really focused on what we called the usefulness equation, that information is useful based on how relevant it is, how valid it is, and then divided by how much work it takes to get the information. And where we found that we were different from the traditional McMaster evidence-based medicine approach was we focused initially on more the idea of relevance, that information is relevant if it has an outcome that patients care about, mainly just living longer or living better. And it's also relevant if it had a high probability of being valid, that it would require clinicians to change their behavior. So it was all about, we call those poems, to distinguish them from does, as Steve was saying, do's and poos, but we call them poems and does, but patient-oriented evidence versus disease-oriented evidence. So we've really spent our whole career since then hoping to train clinicians to make decisions more effectively by focusing on patient-oriented evidence, and most recently using the idea of them becoming aware of poems as they come out so that they can kind of proactively avoid overuse or proactively stop doing overuse that they've been doing. So we're struggling with some of the same things you are here. How do we afford healthcare? How do we get it available to the whole community? One of the important ways to do that is to not waste resources on what we call low-value care. So that's a big part of where we've been with it.
Just for the listeners, look, my own journey with information mastery, which will fill in some of the blanks, was via the National Prescribing Centre and colleagues Professor Neil Maskery and Jonathan Underhill, and Jonathan's obviously been on the pod. That was 2003, 2005-ish, where I remember Neil going across to the States, came back, described this life-changing course that he'd been on. Jonathan promptly went across to the States, came back and described this life-changing course. We then had you and Alan then visited the UK in 2005, is that correct?
I think we came over 3 or 4 times, but that was the first time, yep.
Yeah, 2005, Cheshire and Cardiff. And so I know Steve attended the session in Cheshire and Gimmo attended the one in Cardiff. And then I did manage myself to get to Boston then for the life-changing experience and came and did the advanced program in Boston and had a fantastic...
Yeah, Jamie, you gave, I still remember, we asked you to kind of introduce the workshop, having been there before. I'm not just saying this to be nice, but you gave the greatest and nicest and most it was just the best introduction that we ever had. The only mistake we made was we didn't have it on tape, or we would have used it forever. But
well, it's on tape forever now, Dave. Thank you very much.
I remember that well, Jamie. It was great.
You're not joking about it being life-changing, though, as in working life-changing. Because, Dave, I was at the Cheshire one, and I was there with my boss, Jonathan Cook, who was the chief pharmacist at the time, and I think he was an associate professor at the University of Manchester. And it was life-changing because Paul and Jamie and I talked about when we knew you were coming on, and I found my DVD of all your slides from 2005. And on the last but one episode, I was saying I became a prescriber in 2006. So if I think about it, actually, your information mastery and me then becoming a prescriber shaped my last 15 years have been very much about that, because people often say to me, Steve, how do you seem to know so much, or how do you seem to know all the relevant stuff? And all the time people say that, like pre-reg pharmacists or people who finish their postgraduate education, they go, employ me now because I know loads of stuff. And I go, listen, mate, it's just the start of it. If you can't get to grips now with keeping up to date, then you are going to fail. And it's that what I learned at the Information Mastery. Your equation about, how much time it takes. Is it valid? Is it relevant? And I have this conversation week in, week out with people. You're just getting dragged into looking at stuff that's not important. Move on.
And I was in the Cardiff one. It was one of the things that really brought me into prescribing advice and working with evidence-based practice. But what was great about it was that it taught you to think about how you use the information, whereas I think our mindset was just, how do we absorb as much information as possible? I did the same. I didn't have the DVD, I couldn't find it, but I found an old folder buried in Dropbox or something with where I'd saved them. And reading them back, partly I suddenly realised where Jamie gets loads of his stuff from, because it was a bit like listening to Jamie doing one of his presentations, reading it back.
Seen it, pinched it, spent it.
Yeah, that's it. But it's what? We're talking, I'm trying to do the maths, 16 years ago. We talked about it with Jonathan Underhill the other week, and it's all still relevant today.
One of our colleagues at Tufts, who was a fellow there with Alan, her name was Randy Sokol. She's an MD, but she wrote a paper that was actually, we were co-authors, but it was in BMJ EBM a couple years ago, but it was called something about transformational learning, and just this idea that, we learn things, but every now and then we learn something that transforms our entire worldview. You guys are kind of talking about that. It's nice. It's one of those things you kind of hope to be able to do when you're a teacher. It's one of those things you always feel like that if it really happens, it wasn't so much you that caused it. It was more that it was a truth that maybe came through you. We've always felt the same way about it too. It kind of transformed the way I think, just as it did for you. So we're just excited to be able to share it.
I can't recall a better educational legacy in my career where it's had such a profound impact, if I'm honest. And so I've still got my folder, which is ironic because I still deliver the sessions. The first couple of intros are Dilbert's Monument to Temporary Knowledge, aren't they? Suggesting you've got a big binder. And so I've still got my big binder, and it's Dilbert's Monument to Temporary Knowledge. As Steve said, that strategy for learning, for that strategy for keeping up to date was the thing that I just thought, wow. And that's what I've shared with audiences right across the country and continue to do so.
So just having a quick look at the slides today, guidelines are a cookbook medicine, but a good cook not only knows the recipe, they know how to spice up the taste. I thought that was good. And then there's a quote from Al Gore. So this was 2005, but it's still relevant today. The current state of information management resembles the worst aspects of our old agricultural policy, which left grain rotting in thousands of storage silos while people were left to starve.
Knowledge, it is so important, isn't it? So I'll go back to Jonathan Cook, who was a very inspirational boss for me, and he used to say to me that knowledge is power. And also, and I know what you were saying back then, and I completely agree with you, is that we needed to move from, it's not about knowing everything, it's about knowing what's the most relevant, isn't it? What's got the most benefit, and with evidence with it, and where to find it. Because as Atul Gawande in his Reith lecture said, the volume and skills of knowledge has exceeded individual capabilities when he talks about medicine in the 21st century. But the other thing that Jonathan used to say to me towards the end, before he retired, and I thought this was really insightful, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying it, and I've heard other people say it since, is as you get towards the end of your career and you're trying to keep up to date, it's like you don't want to get found out. So even if you don't know everything, if you know where to go or who to ask, like our Mindlines discussion last week, that's one way of still keeping in the game, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I'm getting sort of towards the end of my career, and I work a lot with patients still and residents seeing patients, and I'm a master at being able to look stuff up quickly. I look it up in a source that I know, actually it's Essential Evidence Plus, but it's based on poems and as much as it can be. So, it keeps it relevant. One of the things that's changed, there's been a few things that have changed since the beginning, but one of them is we've realized how much it sort of goes along with shared decision making. I know you talked about that. The idea that, you sit down with a patient and you don't always have perfect evidence, or you realize finally that evidence is more of a probability than a certainty. And so we present that to our patients, and my patients always appreciated that I actually pulled up some of the poems that we would write and actually show it to him and say, this is, your cardiologist might do it this way, but I think the evidence really says this is a better way to do it, and you kind of let me know what you'd like to do. And it has really helped shape me as a doc to be able to do that.
I've got one last memory, and it's of my trip to Boston. Sorry, folks. And so when I went to Boston in 2009, the hotel I was staying in had one of those sci-fi conferences going on, those massive conventions. So there were stormtroopers and R2-D2, and I got in the lift with Leonard Nimoy.
No
I
way.
got in the lift.
You were bullshitting.